Good morning to everybody. As I passed out earlier, we're doing something a little bit different today. We're going to try to start doing what we're going to call a youth message at the beginning. Not necessarily that is targeted towards youth, but something just a little bit shorter, something a little bit more descriptive, I think will help complement the sermons that we're going through. And what we're going to do for the next probably 6 or 7 weeks is we're going to go through Psalm 23. And of course, most of us are familiar with the Psalms, but if we're not, they are just a great place to go when we read the psalmists, those who have written these different Psalms, express their feelings. And at times, the Psalms express feelings of frustration or concerns or fear. But most of the time, the Psalms are expressing feelings of joy, of appreciation, of confidence. And one of the best known, and perhaps probably the best known and most loved Psalms of all, is Psalm 23. And in Psalm 23, we have the most famous psalmist of all, David, writing a psalm in which he expresses his confidence in God's goodness and his character and his ability to be able to deliver him and take care of him. Now, the Psalms are a great place to go anytime that we're struggling with something, because no matter what we are feeling, if we go into the Psalms, we will probably pretty quickly find something that speaks to exactly what we are dealing with. While it may not always be exactly what we want to hear, we can be pretty confident that is what God knows that we need to hear. And in Psalm 23, we have this beloved psalm because it is such a source of encouragement, but it's a psalm that was written not probably in a time when things were going well, but likely in a time where David was actually fleeing for his life. And perhaps this may have been when he was fleeing from his son Absalom, or perhaps it was when he was fleeing from the previous king Saul. But in the midst of David fleeing for his life, he writes a psalm in which he expresses how confident he is that God will take care of him. And he does so using this very descriptive language, the language of a sheep and its shepherd. Now, David knew something about sheep and shepherd because before he was king, David was a shepherd. And so he speaks to language that would be familiar for him and that would relate to something that not only he grew up knowing, but also many of the people who read this psalm would as well. Now, much of Psalm 23 focuses on what a good shepherd is, but it's also important for us to recognize what it reveals to us about sheep. If people are familiar with sheep, there's something that's different about sheep than other livestock. Sheep are not independent. They don't take care of themselves like other livestock do. They require a great deal of maintenance and care. And for someone to be over a herd of sheep, the flock of sheep, it means that they have to express diligent care and oversight and protection to those sheep. Now, sheep can be very valuable and very beneficial, and so many shepherds, especially shepherds that would own their sheep, this was the most precious and important asset that they had. And many of them would work with and invest everything that they had into these sheep, and so they protected these sheep with everything they had because they knew that if something happened to the sheep, that they would be ruined. And in turn, because the shepherds were expected to take such care to their sheep, we recognize that the sheep belonged to that shepherd. And there was a sense of dependence and this close relationship with them. But a sheep was very dependent on whether or not that sheep had a good shepherd or not. And there were a couple things that a good shepherd needed to have. One is that a shepherd had to have ability. A shepherd needed to be strong because that shepherd had to physically protect his sheep. And so it was expected that that shepherd would be able to protect against dangers, protect against someone trying to rob, or protect against wild animals. That a shepherd would be knowledgeable because that shepherd had to take the sheep where they would be able to go, that they would be able to find the food and water that they need. And so that shepherd had to make good decisions and be experienced and had to take them in places that they could be taken care of. But a shepherd also had to have good character because in order for a shepherd to take care of his sheep, he had to be willing to sacrifice for those sheep, to have compassion and concern, to pay attention to those sheep at all times. And sadly, some shepherds just didn't care enough about their sheep, and the sheep would suffer as a result. But when a sheep had a good shepherd, that sheep could be the most blessed of all animals. And when David talks about the Lord being his shepherd, he, as a shepherd, puts himself in the position of a sheep who has the greatest possible shepherd looking over him. There's a great book that I'll pull a lot of information from, and some of you may be familiar with, and it's Philip Keller's A Shepherd Looks at Psalm 23. And in that book, Philip Keller tells some of the experiences that he had as a shepherd in East Africa. And one of the things that he talked about was that some sheep, sadly, would never be content. And what he means by that is that even if they were in the best possible position and they were in pastures that were green and had everything possible around them, that they were always looking for something different. And they would do so to their own destruction. And he talks about this one female sheep, this ewe that he had, that sheep was a very valuable, a very beautiful sheep, but that sheep would never be content in her pasture and would constantly be trying to escape and would get over a fence into grounds where she was in danger and she would not find the food and the water that she needed. And you have to go back and rescue her and bring her back. And so when he says here, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want, he says, because he knows the Lord is his shepherd, he would be content in the position that God has placed him in. And remember, he's saying this even as he is fleeing for his life. And he's able to express that contentment to know even though he feels in danger, he knows that he's not going to try to get outside of God's will because he knows that ultimately God knows best for him. Because he's confident as a shepherd who spends a lot of time outside. Imagine someone who spent their days roaming around pastures and was looking at creation and would spend their nights under the stars and would look and would realize that God has made all of this and how inconsequential we are. And if the God who has made and controls and in whose hand the entire universe is held looks over us, then there's no question about the ability of our shepherd to look after us. And is that shepherd good? Well, David expressed that when he talks throughout the Psalms about God's mercy and his lovingness and his faithfulness and his kindness. And then 1,000 years later and 28 generations later, his descendant through human lineage, Jesus, fully God but fully man, says, I am the good shepherd. And indeed, he is confirming what David knew and was speaking about even at that time. God is the perfect shepherd because he not only has all of the ability, more ability than we can possibly imagine, but he is a perfect character, holiness, and love. And that if we belong to him as our shepherd, if he holds us in his hand, if he calls us by name, then we will never be in want. So the question to us is the Lord our shepherd? Because when Jesus says he knows his sheep and he calls them by name, sadly there are some sheep that are not his. But he invites us to belong to him. And if we will accept him as our master, as our shepherd, and we'll follow him and we'll trust him, and we'll commit our lives to him, then we can know that we will never be in want. We can know that we will never be in danger beyond what he places in. And we know that eternally we can be secure. And that even in a situation like David was in, fleeing for his life, that we can have the contentment that David had even there, knowing the Lord is our shepherd and we shall not want.